Welcome back. You are here on the map. Coming up, John Bolton on Iraq's oil law, but first, a word from one of his sponsors.
You don't want to be so intrusive that you feed the insurgency, that you give credence to those that are lying and suggesting that we're there for their oil or we're there to occupy them in perpetuity.
That was 2005. These days, the spin from Washington is that it's up to the Iraqis to work out their own problems. Whether it's the sectarian violence or the reconstruction or the distribution of oil wealth, they just keep saying over and over, it's up to the Iraqis. In fact, it's so up to the Iraqis that the cream of the Bush Brigade has marched through Baghdad recently to remind the Iraqi government just how up to them it is. First, Condoleezza Rice flew in to give a little encouragement. Then Defense Secretary Robert Gates dropped by to bump up the pressure. Then the big gun Dick Cheney personally delivered one of his trademark thinly veiled threats.
We believe it's very important to move on the issues before us in a timely fashion, and that any undue delay would be difficult to explain.
Yeah, hard to explain, unless you're the Iraqi parliament, which has been deadlocked over this contentious bill for months. Recently, I had a chance to engage in a battle of spin with former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. Here's what happened. Hi there.
Hi, how are you?
So, the Iraqi parliament's passage of this oil law is one of the top benchmarks for both Republicans and Democrats alike. Why is it so important to the United States to get this law passed in Iraq?
Well, I think the real issue is for the Iraqis themselves. The question of the distribution of the revenues from oil production is critical in that country. Under Saddam, the Sunnis benefited disproportionately. The Shiites got very little, the Kurds got very little, and this is an issue that goes to the question whether the various confessional factions in Iraq can live together and allocate that oil revenue fairly. So there's political significance to be sure, there's economic significance. It fits together in the big picture.
To a magnificent answer that avoided my question. How important is it to the United States? Was it important enough, for instance, for the U.S. to be involved in the drafting of the law?
Well, I think in several respects there's a divergence of opinion. My own view is that the main U.S. strategic interest in Iraq today is making sure that no part of it becomes a base for terrorism. How they allocate their oil revenues, whether they have a federal Iraq or three separate Iraqs, is a lot less important than focusing on the terrorism issue. I think those who want one Iraq with a pretty strong central government think that working out this oil legislation is critical. But the real issue is for the Iraqis themselves. We're not going to determine what kind of country they have going forward. They have to determine that.
Here's a quote from an Iraqi legislator from the National Dialogue Front, which is a small secular party. The feeling is that the law is focused very much on sectarianism. It divides the country and the wealth into groups, Kurds, Sunnis, Shiites. So with all of the factions in this model fighting over the big prize, which of course is 95% of Iraq's economy, isn't the law itself a recipe for locking in the sectarian bloodbath?
The criticism you've just read could turn out to be accurate. It could be a further fractionating of the Iraqi polity into three different parts.
So then what you're suggesting then is that this law ought to be withdrawn because it's obviously dividing rather than uniting Iraqis.
No, I frankly don't care what the outcome of this law is. To me, again, whether there's one Iraq, whether there's an Iraq that's federated into three pieces, whether there are three Iraqs, is not an American strategic interest. The basis on which this or any other proposed legislation should be judged is whether over the long term it conduces to stability in the region and does not provide a base for terrorists.
Let's talk a little bit about these production sharing agreements. Iraq has some of the easiest oil in the world to extract. So why are these kinds of contracts being pushed on Iraq?
Well, I think it's a risk-sharing proposition. Even here, where you know pretty much where the oil is, or at least where large deposits of it are, the oil companies are hedging against the rise of extremism, the threat of terrorism, and the possibility of expropriation.
But again, you have to be really incompetent as an oil company not to make money off of Iraq's oil if you're in there. You've got some of the lowest production costs in the world at about $2 a barrel. And in countries where these...
I don't think it has anything to do with production costs. I think they're factoring in a risk premium.
Well, Terrific, then. Surely this law should simply then wait until some security is regained in the country at large, and then everyone will be in a position to negotiate on a real basis. Because what's wrong with these PSAs is that they can lock in contracts negotiated in the midst of a civil war for 10 or 20 or 30 years when those conditions may no longer exist. In other words, that they're seen in Iraq and around the world as massively in favor of the oil companies rather than the country's interest.
I don't think that's true at all. If they don't want the oil companies in, let them try and pump it on their own and see how much they're able to get out of the ground. It's in Iraq's interest to get this oil into the world market to give the government the revenues it needs.
Well, let's talk about how the law could ensure that Iraqis actually benefit from these oil deals.
Because Iraq gets a percentage of the revenues of the sales. This is not a conflict between the government of Iraq and those big, evil, terrible multinational oil companies.
Hey, you said it, not I.
The fundamental issue here is how the government's going to divide the proceeds among Iraqis. That's what the real dispute is about.
But in a country which is in the middle of a civil war with massive unemployment, employment guarantees are a hugely significant symbolic gesture that says this law will lock in benefits to Iraqis. That's why developing countries all over the world, like Angola and Nigeria and Brazil and Indonesia, have local content requirements. So why couldn't this law have that in Iraq?
Because those are highly inefficient requirements for the oil companies. In any event, they are going to hire a lot of Iraqi people. There's no doubt about that. The fact is, Iraq's economy...
Why is there no doubt about that? Because there's been very, very little hiring of Iraqis for all the contractors that have been in the last 4 years.
The issue here is having some level of confidence that production levels can rise adequately to provide revenues for the government. And that's what the multinationals are seeking. If the Iraqis have some other place to go to get these skills, then let them go there.
Wouldn't you have to leave first before they could do that?
Now the issue is what is the best way to bring a maximum amount of Iraqi production on stream into the global oil market in the short term. And I think that's clearly the only places where capacity exists to do that is in the multinationals, and that's why Iraq is negotiating with them.
I have the sort of staff list from the Coalition Provisional Authority here, the CPA government that was in charge under Paul Bremer, and I'm going to read you the list of the staff for the Ministry of Oil. Philip Carroll, former Chief Executive of the U.S. Division of Royal Dutch Shell, Robert McGee, former ConocoPhillips Executive, Gary Vogler, former executive with ExxonMobil, Mike Stinson, former executive with ConocoPhillips. That was the oil ministry under Paul Bremer. Why would Iraqis think anything other than U.S. pressure equals multinational interests? That's the message that's been sent from the very start.
Because the oil ministry under Saddam was all Ba'ath Party Sunnis who could no more be counted on to create a fair allocation of the proceeds.
Than multinationals would be now?
You know, I'm just going to say this one more time, and maybe your listeners will get the point. The debate in the Iraqi parliament, and what's important here, is the allocation of the aggregate proceeds to Iraq among Shiites, Sunni, and Kurds.
Paul Bremer privatized 200 state companies by decree, but he didn't touch the oil after the initial invasion and occupation. And wasn't the fear that this was the one thing that could bring Iraqis together to fight the occupation? Now, 4 years later, you're in the middle of a brutal civil war, and the U.S. is finally pushing through the oil law. Isn't the civil war really the only context in which you can succeed in pushing through this law?
No, I think this is a measure of whether the Iraqis are going to find a way out of this civil war that they've been engaged in, because they've agreed on how to divvy up the critical asset that they have, which is the oil revenues. If they can't do that, then I think it was an indication the civil war was inevitable and will continue, unfortunately for them.
John Bolton, thanks for being on The Map.
Happy to do it.
Coming up, my caption on this year's class photo in Heiligendamm. Back after this.